Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar entitled The Development and Use of Outcomes to Evaluate Beginning Farmer and Rancher Training Programs. We are really glad to have you here today. So in particular, I'm very excited to have Tom Archibald with us today. Tom is an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Agricultural Leadership and Community Education at Virginia Tech, where he also directs the Feed the Future Senegal Youth and Agriculture Project. He's a winner of the American Evaluation Association Marcia Gutentag Promising New Evaluator Award, and he serves on the board of the Eastern Evaluation Research Society and is an associate editor of the journal Evaluation and Program Planning. He facilitates numerous evaluation capacity building workshops each year for Virginia Cooperative Extension, the American Evaluation Association, and other groups. And it's this extensive experience helping groups do their own evaluation that he'll be offering us today. So he'll be providing insight on how to develop and use outcomes in program evaluation. My name is Jan Perez, and I will be the host for today's webinar. I'm a food systems research and education specialist focusing on program evaluation at the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems, which is a research and education center located at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I'm also the lead for the group project, which I'll describe shortly. And my role today will be to briefly share some context about the recent evaluation tools we've created at the group project, as well as a few tips at the end for incorporating these materials that we'll talk about today into a BFRDP proposal. And I'll be jointly answering questions with Tom regarding the tools we created at the end. So the GREW project. GREW stands for Gaining Results Through Evaluation Work. It's an educational enhancement team project funded by the USDA's Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. The purpose of the project is to help organizations who train beginning farmers and ranchers to do more and better evaluation. It's basically a capacity building project. The project involves developing resources, training through webinars, and professional development through our learning community, and we'll talk more about some of our products a bit later on. So before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items to review. By now, hopefully you can all hear us. And there are two options of ways to connect to the audio shown here. If you're having any technical difficulties, please contact Vanessa Ackerman in the chat box or email her directly. If you can't see the screen, you can always go back to your registration confirmation and her email is there. As a reminder, everyone has been placed on mute to reduce background noise, so please do keep yourself on mute. So we'll have time for questions and answers at the end, and we'll use the chat box. However, do feel free to ask questions there throughout the session, and we'll get to them again at the end. If you don't see the chat box feature, you can get there through the program toolbar, which usually hides at the bottom of the Zoom window, and you just have to move your cursor over the bottom for it to show up. Or it can be found on the primary toolbar for your computer or operating system, and we have a Mac system shown here. Please note that we are recording this webinar, and it will be placed on our website shortly. We'll send out a link to everyone who's registered as soon as it's up. And also at the end, of course, we'll be asking you to take a very brief survey to help us improve what we do. So we're ready for Tom. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then you can start sharing yours.
Okay, thank you, Jan. It's a real honor to be here and be able to share some thoughts with the group on developing outcomes to support better programming for beginning farmers and ranchers. So yes, as Jan mentioned, today we'll be covering three topics. Number one, various methods to approach this task of identifying outcomes, and especially relying on the recently revealed GREW tools that Jan mentioned, some examples of specific outcomes and data collection approaches for beginning farmer and rancher programs. And then just to tie it all together, some reminders about why this work of using outcomes in thinking about outcomes in program planning and evaluation is so important and so potentially useful. And to begin with the end in mind, which is a phrase you often hear in evaluation, whatever's compelling you to think more about the potential outcomes of your programs and how to better collect data on them, I like to frame all of the evaluation work and evaluation capacity work I do in the framework of utilization-focused evaluation. So whatever decisions you make about which outcomes to focus on and how to collect data on them, it's important to always keep in mind the ultimate step of using that information. And of course, there's numerous potential uses of outcome evaluation. Number one, well, in no particular order, accountability. So more and more, the institutions and agencies that are supporting this type of work do look for us to be able to make stronger claims about the outcomes and impacts of our program. But there's also additional uses such as continuous program improvement, learning, and even contributing to the broader knowledge base around this type of programming that are also very pertinent uses for doing outcome evaluation. So just before we start thinking about how to identify outcomes, just a few basic terms. And Jan and I certainly do realize that there's a wide array of expertise amongst those who are joining the webinar. So forgive us if some of it feels like review, but we wanted to try to get everyone on the same page since we do realize there's a diversity in background around evaluation. So outcomes, put simply, are the desired changes or results stemming from a program's activities or efforts. They're often divided into short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes. And generally speaking, the short-term, as you see, are changes in knowledge, attitude, skills, awareness, or intentions, generally among the program participants, so those who had a direct contact with the program. Then medium-term are those changes in behaviors that result as a follow-on to those changes in knowledge, attitude, etc. And then the long-term begins to get at outcomes and results which may even be accruing for people and groups who did not necessarily directly participate in the program, but it's those more downstream positive effects, ideally positive effects of the program. Now it's important to keep in mind indicators as well. Indicators are really the way of operationalizing or really making manifest the outcomes. In everyday language, I often like to use the phrase, how would you know it if you saw it? So if you identify an outcome, could be a change in knowledge, could be some shift in a practice, and you were walking down the street or walking onto a farm and you saw that practice happening, how would you know it when you saw it? That's the concrete, observable, measurable element of the outcome that allows you to make strong empirical claims about, hopefully, the relationship between your program and that particular outcome. So it can be a way of taking something which sometimes can seem a little fuzzy and making it more concrete. This is just another definition or sort of description of outcomes, this one coming from the University of Wisconsin Extension, sort of from a more narrative perspective, asking the question, so what? What difference does the program make in people's lives? And highlighting that outcomes can be intended or unintended, positive or negative. Sometimes we tend to look under the streetlight for our lost keys because we have desired outcomes, so we're looking where we're shining the light. But there are a few approaches, some of which I'll share with you today, that can allow us to get at unintended consequences. And as much as we all hope to be identifying positive outcomes, it's important to also have an approach that is open to finding out what's not working as well. Outputs are defined slightly differently by different folks. I like to think of them as something that's tangible as the immediate result of the program, so including participation. So if you had 12 potential new farmers participate in the program, the list of those participants, that's an output, as well as any tangible materials that they create as a result of participating, such as a whole farm management plan or a business plan, something like that. Things that you can count up and identify, get your hands on. Now, I included the definition of output because all too often in various types of programming, we stop at the level of outputs and we forget to keep asking those so what questions to get to outcomes. So a few last terms before jumping into how to identify outcomes that are important to share are summative, formative, and participatory evaluation. So you may have come across these before, but just as a reminder, summative evaluation is that which is done at the end of a program, however you're defining the program. And it's trying to make some claim about what happened as a result of the program. And very often it's used for accountability or reporting purposes. Formative evaluation, on the other hand, is something that's done while the program is being run. It can even begin at the phase of program planning. You could consider needs assessment a type of formative evaluation. But it's really focusing in on the processes of program implementation with a primary desire to improve the program as it goes. Now, both summative or formative evaluation can be more or less participatory, which, as the name suggests, simply means involving stakeholders of a program in the evaluation process at any stage, going from design all the way through reporting. So these are three types of evaluation which you may consider as an overarching framework as you try to choose which outcomes to focus on. So how can we identify outcomes? Today we're sharing with you at least 4 separate approaches. They certainly overlap, but I think as a good heuristic device, thinking about these 4 different approaches can really help us expand our horizons about how to get to outcomes. And those are program theory or program logic, educational or other social science theories, various pre-existing evaluation frameworks which guide our thinking towards particular types of outcomes, and then finally the specific GRU tools that we'll be sharing with you today. So as you probably know, when we talk about program theory or logic, we're thinking about logic models. Logic models have a checkered history in the evaluation field. Some people dislike them, some people like them a lot. As we've moved toward more systems evaluation and evaluation that's sensitive to complexity and dynamic conditions, logic models have been questioned as being too linear and too rigid. But even a lot of systems evaluators still find that setting out and sitting down and doing the hard work of articulating the program logic through a logic model at the very outset of a program is a very, very good idea. And it's also usually required or at least strongly favored by USDA and NIFA. So you see, of course, this is the version of a logic model that was put forward by Ellen Taylor Powell and colleagues at University of Wisconsin Extension some years ago. And you see divided inputs, outputs, and then the short, medium, and long-term outcomes. This template and other guidance documents are available for free on the University of Wisconsin Extension website shown here. Then there is a slight distinction between a logic model and what some might call a theory of change diagram. So the image that you see on the screen is a particular approach to articulating in a schematic way the theory of change of a program. In this case, it's a simple format that was developed by the Cornell Office for Research on Evaluation some years ago that we tend to call a pathway model. So on one hand, it's just a different graphical representation of a logic model, but it adds a significant amount of new information because it has arrows saying that not everything in every column is hypothesized to lead to everything else. It allows you to have a greater level of detail, but still with the same basic building blocks, activities, outputs, and then short, mid, and long-term outcomes. And actually, one of the GRU tools that we'll be sharing today is a theory of change at a very broad level, but that can also guide your thinking towards outcomes for your specific programs. So we'll share that specific pathway model in just a few moments here. So that's how you can get outcomes inspired from program logic or program theory. Now, what do we mean by gaining guidance from educational or other social science theories? One that some of you may be familiar with is Bloom's taxonomy, which has been updated in recent decade or so, which really divides, it's a bit hierarchical, but types of desired cognitive outcomes that you would want to see among program participants or people in a learning situation that go from lower order thinking skills on the bottom of the slide up to higher order thinking skills according to psychology. So passing through knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and of course at the summit, evaluation. And you see inside the different colored sections of the light bulb particular verbs that can be used if you're writing learning objectives for a program, but you can also harvest from those verbs to get that into your outcome language. So if you have a program that's really trying to push the participants to go beyond just knowing things, but actually being able to apply them, analyze them, synthesize them, you might consider taking some of those verbs from the top of the light bulb and including them in your outcome language. A similarly very well-known and popular framework from education and evaluation is called the Kirkpatrick model. And as widely as this is used, it is actually designed, I'm going to say, just to provide a framework for evaluating trainings. It's really the Kirkpatrick model for training evaluation. But it does help, again, as a rule of thumb, to think through the different levels from reaction to learning to impact to results. So in so much as your programs involve trainings, this approach provides a good piece of guidance for whether or not it helps you get specific language for the outcome. It gives you further evidence-based grounding to say why you're looking, say, at learning and impact, as opposed to maybe results at a given moment in the evolutionary stage of a program. So here you see you move from going through the participants' satisfaction and reaction through the actual occurrence of learning, then to the more medium-term impacts of changes in behavior, as we saw from the theory-based approach, and then finally the results, which you could say are medium or long-term outcomes, possibly shading towards impact of the program. Then there are a whole host of social theories that could be more or less appropriate and applicable as you think through the big question of what do I think is going on here and how would I know it if I saw it? So a relatively popular theory is this theory of planned behavior that is very well evidence-based, shows how a particular program participant can arrive at behavior change by passing through this change in intentions, which is related back to attitudes, norms, and perceived behavioral control, or otherwise put, how much control they have over various decisions, which in the case of beginning farmer and rancher programming could be something like the participants' perceived notion about access to land, access to capital, the different things that various program participants might be worrying about. So again, this is just another way to add a layer of evidence behind your selection of outcomes, which can be both very legitimizing as well as provide an instrumental support in helping you just brainstorm different outcomes. This is a similar social science theory that's used more in human development, but I think can be applied to something like beginning farmer and rancher programming. This is from Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. And as a systems theory, it just articulates that the individual with their various characteristics are nested within different systems that influence what happens and the various outcomes that occur for that individual. So since we often take a farming systems approach to thinking about beginning farming and ranching, taking ecological social systems theory to identify outcomes could also make sense. And then bringing it closer back to food systems, this resource, which I know many of you know about, the Whole Measures for Community Food Systems, also provides insights into the different types of outcomes that you may want to include. And of course, this is from a value-driven perspective, so emphasizing justice and fairness, strong communities, vibrant farms, healthy people, sustainable ecosystems, and thriving local economies. So the booklet that accompanies the Whole Measures is an excellent source of inspiration for identifying potential outcomes for the types of programming that you're all involved in. Based on that, here in Virginia, the Virginia Cooperative Extension program team focusing on community, local, regional food systems has developed a theoretical conceptual framework for thinking about food system work as a whole, which once again just provides insight on probably medium to long-term outcomes of the types of programming we're talking about today. But you see in the outer ring with the arrows, which gets at the support and process function of this type of programming, things like knowledge, skills, social change, facilitating partnerships. So those are the types of outcomes that you could even see at the short and medium term level. And there's more resources available on this through the Virginia Cooperative Extension site. So then outside of beginning farmer and rancher programming, and even outside of food system work, there are some frameworks which can, again, offer that legitimacy, as well as having the instrumental benefit of giving us tools to think with as we try to identify or create outcomes that we're then going to look to evaluate. I had already shared the three big definitions of formative, summative, and participatory, but this somewhat overwhelming slide is just to remind you that there are a whole host of other types of evaluation that are out there. Not all of them are focused on outcomes, so it's important to remember that while we're focused on outcomes today, there are other types of evaluation, such as context evaluation, needs assessment, implementation evaluation, which don't technically get at outcomes, but if they're the right type of evaluation for your program in its context at this given point in time, they're certainly fair game. Now, I think a very robust evaluation plan would ideally select a few different evaluation questions or evaluation foci from among different types of evaluation, so that you do have some outcome or impact evaluation, as well as possibly some participatory evaluation, process evaluation as well, just to add to the entire evidence base around your program. So without getting too lost in the details here, just know that there are a number of different purposes for doing evaluative inquiry, and each of them is associated with a particular type that you can apply. And if you're interested in any more of these, we can go into any of these particular ones in more detail in the question and answer period. One very well-known approach that's been around for 20 or 30 years is the SIP model, originally proposed by Daniel Stufflebeam, and it's about context, input, process, and product. So in a sense, this is another take on the logic model, because you think about context, input, process, product, you probably hear echoes of logic model thinking. But again, it's a very well-established system for evaluation or approach to evaluation that can point you towards different elements which might form the grounding for particular outcomes, especially as we look at product evaluation, impact, effectiveness, transportability, sustainability, and then adjustments to the program as it adapts to different contexts. This is actually more so a framework of the whole endeavor of program planning and evaluation, but especially since it's called Getting to Outcomes, I thought we would be remiss if we didn't share it with you in this webinar on getting to outcomes. This is an approach that was really developed by Abe Wandersman and supported by both the Centers for Disease Control as well as the RAND Corporation. And it's kind of makes sense if you stop and think about it. But I think this is helpful too, because it reminds us that outcomes don't just fall from the sky. And it's not just once a year when we're writing a grant proposal that it's time to think about outcomes. Getting to outcomes, both from a programmatic side and from an evaluation side, is part of an ongoing cycle of program planning, evaluating, and improving. That's probably naturally what you do in your program already, but this framework, which is again quite evidence-based and quite widely respected, can give you a roadmap towards not just getting to outcomes once a year when it's time to report on your programs or write a new proposal, but really embedding this thinking about outcomes in the entire cycle of program planning and evaluation. Lastly, in terms of frameworks, and this is an evaluation approach which has been shared and promoted via the GRU project previously, is the Systems Evaluation Protocol developed at the Cornell Office for Research on Evaluation. And it's another easy to use guide that is touching on much more than just getting to outcomes, but it does involve a number of steps that you can walk through. You can download this guide from the website shown on the screen. And again, just one more evaluation-wide framework or approach that can help you get to outcomes. This one is really predicated on the theory of change model that I showed earlier. That's sort of the main way of getting to outcomes through this approach, but there's a lot of tip sheets and handouts and guides built into the systems evaluation protocol that you can use if you want to really dive deeper into the theory-based way of using a theory of change model to get at outcomes. And one, we think, relatively salient and novel approach to identifying outcomes that is contained within the systems evaluation protocol is to be really explicit about the fact that programs are not all monoliths, especially in terms of their developmental or evolutionary stage. Some programs, which are just starting out, being offered for the first time, lend themselves to particular types of evaluation, even particular types of outcomes. So you could say that participants signing up for and expressing appreciation for a program, while those sound like implementation indicators, they could be even construed as outcomes if that's the stage of development of the program. So it might not be appropriate to look at system level changes in an ecosystem or in an economy if the program's just been run for 2 or 3 times a few hours per week. So the real point here is that to do high quality evaluation, you need to have good alignment between the evaluation lifecycle and the program lifecycle. And there are particular types of evaluation questions and evaluation outcomes or program outcomes, which are more or less appropriate given where you are on this developmental stage. So here in the graph on the screen, you see program A with the red circle is well aligned because the dot falls on the red line. So here you have a program which is fairly well advanced. It's in stage 4A, meaning it's been well protocolized, it's been offered for years, there's a strong curriculum, it's probably been tested in a few different contexts. And similarly, the evaluation is in stage 4A, which is very focused on impacts, usually using a control group or a comparison group. So it produces a relatively robust evidence base for that program, and it's all good because it's well aligned. But if you look at program B, it's a program that's been around for a while, maybe a couple of years. It's been offered in a few different contexts. There's a guide for the facilitators, but the evaluation is at a very early life cycle, 1B, meaning they're probably still asking questions about satisfaction. Did you like the food? Did you like the venue? And the risk there is that they may be affecting pretty significant changes amongst the participants and the communities in which the participants are nested, but missing out on telling the story of that outcome because they're not asking the right questions. They're not focused on the right outcomes. So that's a case of misalignment. Another way that you can fall into a case of misalignment is if you're above the red line, like with the case of the green circle C. Well, here, the program is still in its early initiation stages. Maybe it's the first year it's being offered. The way it's offered is still in flux. It's dynamic, it's changing as the educators are trying to adapt to the different realities of their participants. However, for one reason or another, they're applying an evaluation approach which is not ideal for a program that's still in that rapid cycles of flux and change. So that might be like a pre-post evaluation or even a quasi-experimental design using some control or comparison. That risks being a huge waste of resources, as well as possibly getting to type 1 or type 2 error, where you're either finding an effect of the program when really it's not a valid conclusion because the program contains so much noise, so much variation that what you're comparing at the beginning of the program and the end are actually 2 different entities. So it doesn't even make sense. Or on the other hand, you expend all these resources to do a relatively robust evaluation and you find no program effects, again, because of the noise contained within the program. Whereas in front of your eyes, you're seeing the participants and their communities change, But you say, how come we didn't find it in our evaluation? Well, because the evaluation approach and the outcomes that you chose were not well aligned with the life cycle development of the program. So here, this is focusing on the notion of evaluation questions, which I'm going to come back to in just a moment. But evaluation questions are one way of approaching the notion of outcomes. So these are the big overarching questions that really answer the question, what is it that you want to know about your program? So this guide just shows that depending on the phase of the program lifecycle, over on the left, moving from early lifecycle programs down to later programs, there are different elements of the logic model or program model that you should be focusing on. Early on, you might want to just focus on the various varied assumptions. Then you move through the activities, the outcomes, and eventually the linkages between the activities and the outcomes. And then there are implications there for what types of evaluation questions or EQs to ask, which outcomes to focus on. You see here they've just left generic outcomes, like as a group, do participants engaged in activity A change on outcome X? So that outcome X could be knowledge, a skill, a behavior. And as you get further down, you get into those impacts, the broader societal, ecological, social, or economic changes that are ideally happening in some cases as a result of your program, or at the very least, you can make the claim that your program is contributing to those changes at the broader level, even if you can't make the claim of attribution, saying that we caused this. So with that, that brings us to the evaluation-specific tools that GRU has developed over the last year. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jan to talk a little bit more about these various tools.
Great, thank you, Tom. All right, so before we developed the GRU project, and as part of the first year of the project, we did a needs assessment about a year ago. We had quite a bit of feedback that people want examples of outcomes for beginning farmer and rancher programs. So the diagrams we came up with and our outcome lists were all intended to address those needs. So generally, they're meant to provide ideas so that programs can use and bounce off of and, excuse me, and then further refine and address their own organization needs according to their own content and context and needs and goals. So what I'm going to do is just briefly touch on these now. So this diagram is an example theory of change, as Tom talked about earlier. And this is for a hypothetical beginning and farmer rancher training program, and it's specifically for aspiring farmers. So it basically provides some ideas of what a theory of change for that kind of program might look like. And again, you can use this to bounce off of and see if those things relate or not, or how they do. Also, our goal is to develop a few more of these and get them on our website. There's a couple others on there now, but we should be getting more soon. This diagram addresses a concern that we've heard quite a bit of: how do you deal with measuring the number of people who start to farm when it can take so long for people to do that because of the multiple barriers? So what this diagram shows is a number of interim outcomes that can happen on the way to start farming. And so one really useful thing to do, particularly in a shorter term program, a 1 to 3 year program, is to track these interim outcomes, particularly if your audience is going to have a hard time starting to farm. So, and these interim outcomes are also arranged by the different types of educational activities that you might expect for different types of activities. On the far right in the green are some desired or alternative work outcomes. So, of course, the BFRDP program is interested in people starting or a farm business, but folks who are training beginning and farmer ranchers may have other goals as well listed here, and it can also be useful to track kind of the unexpected outcomes that might happen for those aiming to be an independent farmer, but due to the difficulties of getting there, they may end up in some of these other categories, which can be valuable to track. Another common concern people have had is, how do you define farmer success? Because it can be so many things. So this diagram introduces people to the many possible definitions and shows how they're related to how different programs provide support for farmer success. This diagram can also be useful for project planning, for thinking about what your organization contributes towards farmer success and how it's related to other kinds of programming, ideas of things where you might want to partner with others who cover things that you don't normally do. And more ideas specific on farmer success we'll talk about in the outcome list. And this diagram highlights a variety of possible but not exhaustive long-term or system-level outcomes which programs may aspire to meet with their efforts. While much of the orientation of the BFRDP program looks at individual outcomes, such as farmer success or starting to farm, some projects may focus really directly on making change happen at other levels. So for example, some programs are really about creating a community of support for beginning farmers. Some are also looking at really creating more sustainable food systems and focus on training organic farmers. So those are directly looking at other levels. And then again, pretty much all of our programs are ultimately aimed at something we're hoping that happens long term. And so here's a variety of those kinds of things we might be looking for, which can be really great to use for creating your logic model or theory of change. So this document is our outcome list titled Identifying Outcomes for Program Evaluation. This list basically includes examples of common or frequently used outcomes for beginning farmer and rancher programs, as well as a few other ideas that we hope you'll find useful or may find useful. We developed this primarily based on materials that exist. So we did a huge search looking at final reports to NIFA, RVS report, that's the Results Verification System reports, that's part of, again, BFRDP reporting. We've looked at example surveys we had for different BFR programs. And we also used the evaluation of the BFRDP report conducted and led by the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. Drafts were reviewed by a few different group meetings of a variety of beginning farmer rancher organizations and our advisory team to make sure we at least got really key, we didn't miss any, according to them, key outcomes, although I'm sure a few of you might find things that you would add. Now, this list is not meant to be exhaustive, but illustrative. So we also aren't prescribing what should be, and we aren't describing what we consider the best metrics. Again, these are ideas that are common and just to help give you ideas to bounce off of. And what's showing on the screen right now is an example of one of the pages for the guide, and it's structured by different topics. Here's a topic of production. And then they're structured by listings of short-term outcomes and medium-term. And again, the short-term are things that happen, say, right at the end of some kind of intervention, what happens at the end of a training, a webinar, a field day. And medium-term usually get at what happens down the road. So what kind of actions people take and what are the results or impacts of those actions. Also, what you see here is the example outcomes. We also have included example indicators and example questions for data gathering tools. Again, these are just illustrative and to give people ideas to get started. Also included in the outcome list is a guide for reflecting on what makes most sense for your organizations to help you come up with your own outcomes and indicators. So this basically gives you questions to walk through to help bounce off of with this list. And Tom, you can go ahead and continue.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jan. So I mentioned a little bit earlier this notion of evaluation questions, which for me is really the heart of the evaluative endeavor. And here what I mean is not something like that you would include on a survey or a focus group to collect data directly from participants, but it would be more the overarching question, sort of similar to a research question, but that you want to know. So your outcomes would be housed within these evaluation questions. And the reason I'm bringing this in now is because I actually see a lot of similarity with some of my general guidance I give on how to focus an evaluation question with those reflection prompts, which are contained within the outcome document that Jan was just sharing. So this is a little bit of a recap of things we've already covered today, but how to focus an EQ, which is similar to how to get to identifying an outcome. Use your logic model, your pathway model, your theories, but also think ahead to the desired claims. So if you want to say, after a few years of programming, that our program contributed to all these beautiful things, but all you're doing is collecting data on whether they liked the speaker or whether they learned anything, those might be good outcomes, but there's a disconnect between the outcomes you're collecting data on and the desired claims that you want to make at the end of the day. Then similarly, thinking about that cyclical systems approach to evaluation, evaluation should grow on itself year over year or cycle over cycle. So build on your past evaluations to keep pushing the envelope, pushing further out from left to right along your logical pathway model to try to get to further and further outcomes. We've already discussed the importance of life cycles. And of course, knowing the literature, which you all know the literature and the various reports that are salient to your area of work here, but the tools that you've just seen presented from Jan have done all that work for you. So it's now your go-to source for the leading edge establishment of sort of what is out there in this area of programming. And then lastly, I think this is something that's really important in evaluation, but we often neglect it. So I thought it was important to put it right out there. You know your programs, you know what you think is going on. So let yourself be guided by your intuition and then just make it systematic by making it more explicit and coming up with a data collection approach to get at those outcomes that in your gut you feel is happening from your programming. So just to close this section, these are questions you can ask yourself, similar to the reflection questions included in the outcome guide. What do I want to know about my program? What kinds of claims do I want to be able to make about my program? How do I define the key constructs involved, or the key idea at the center of that outcome? How would I know it if I saw it, or otherwise put what would provide evidence of what I'm trying to assess? And then how could I get at that? How could I, whether it's from a survey, a focus group, an observation, an interview, there's numerous different ways to get at the data. But until you get your outcomes right, don't even worry about what the right tool is for the job, because you can have the right tool for the wrong outcome, and then you're not going to have a good evaluation. So this is a handy tip sheet. This is from the systems evaluation protocol. Once you have your evaluation question, your construct or variable is basically your outcome. So all of those wonderful outcomes listed in the GRU outcome guide are constructs or variables. The indicator column from the guide that Jan showed you is essentially those two middle columns of how is it defined and how would you know it if you saw it. And then that lets you make a more informed decision about how you should actually be collecting data on that tool. So one last idea that I just wanted to share very briefly is this notion of alignment. Now, we've already talked about alignment between the program and the evaluation lifecycle, but here I'm talking more about alignment between your question, your evidence, and your claim. So that getting the right outcome is right at the heart of this alignment. Is the question that you want to know about your program aligned with the right type of evidence that you're gathering to eventually let you make the right claim? And there's been a lot of debate in the evaluation world about what is the gold standard. Patton and others are saying that really getting this alignment between the question, evidence, and claim, what could be called methodological appropriateness, that this is the true gold standard for credible evidence. So we don't have time to go through these examples in great detail, but this on the screen is an example of good alignment. The question makes sense for the method, which makes sense for the analysis, which makes sense for a credible, believable, defendable claim at the end of the day. But if we don't select our outcomes carefully, we often end up in a condition of misalignment. And that's like you're collecting data on whether they liked the speaker and then wanting to make a claim about how many millions of dollars the state saved as a result of this programming. So something has gone off the rails you've lost the thread, you've lost the plot. And the example up on the screen is just a generic example of misalignment happening. And don't feel bad if this happens, because it happens to trained evaluators all the time and PhD students trying to do their research on a given topic. It's very hard to keep that logical through flow throughout. So just thinking in terms of alignment can be a good rule of thumb to help you with that as you try to pick the right outcomes for your program. Lastly, and this is perhaps less pertinent for this system, but it is important to realize that once you've got your outcome nailed down, you have to ask yourself the final question of, okay, in terms of getting a survey or a data collection tool to get at this outcome, should I find one from the existing literature that's out there and just use it off the shelf? Should I find one and adapt it? Or should I grow my own? Should I make my own? And this little decision tree here allows you to make the decision whether you should go to the system. And in this case, at the very least, you should start by looking at the GRU outcome list. And there might not be actually validated surveys in the area of programming that you all work in, but there might be pre-existing surveys that have been used elsewhere. Now, this brings us to one of the most ubiquitous challenges in program evaluation, and that is this dynamic tension between standardization and localization. So, and that's what the GRU tools seek to work within. So that's why Jan said that we're not saying this is exhaustive, we're not saying these are the ones you should use, it's just providing you more fodder to consider. Because if someone else has already proposed this outcome, go ahead and use it rather than reinventing the wheel. But at the end of the day, even if it's a pre-existing data collection tool or a pre-existing outcome and indicator, if it doesn't fit for your context, then it's not the right tool for the job. So there's some happy medium to find between finding an existing outcome or an existing outcome measure versus adapting it versus creating your own that meets your purpose. And in some cases, it should actually be a blend of some existing items on a survey and then your own items that you make specific to that particular program. So with that, we just want to, we began with the end in mind. The ultimate step in good evaluation is use. Don't do anything if it's not useful to you, either for purposes of accountability, for learning, or for program improvement and program adaptation. So whatever outcomes you choose and whatever data collection tools you use, the ultimate goal is growing better programs and using the evaluation insights to support you in your work to make the world a better place. So with that, I will actually pass it back to Jan for a few closing comments before we go to Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
And I'll leave this slide up for now, or should I stop sharing?
Yeah, I think you need to stop sharing for me to. All right. So as I've already seen here, I know there's a great desire to how do we do our BFRDP proposal? And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how this relates. But my first caveat is I am not an official source of information for how to respond to the RFA. So, it's always good to get final questions passed by the BFRDP program officers. And to definitely remember that reviewers are the ones who decide if they think your plan is good. So that's just the caveat of we can tell you what we think is best, but they're the ones who are going to decide. And they come with a varying amount of evaluation experience. So, doing as much of a thought out plan as possible is probably your best bet. Another point is, your primary sources of help to write The RFA is, of course, the RFA instructions themselves on the outcome-based reporting section. There's also the outcome-based reporting guide on the BFRDP website. It looks like the most current one is from 2018. And again, the BFRDP program officers. Tom showed this slide earlier, but I just wanted to reiterate that these are terms used in the RFA, and they're common terms. They're not defined in the RFA, but they are common evaluation terms. And again, Tom talked about them previously, but those can be good things to return to.
And Jan, if I may just jump in quickly, because
please.
There's a question from Groundswell about adapting these processes and approaches to various audiences, including participants and stakeholders who don't speak English. And I would say that might be a great opportunity for a carefully done participatory evaluation approach, because, you know, with audiences such as those, you want to be, of course, really careful to not apply a sort of one-size-fits-all thing. So to the extent that it's feasible or possible, you know, you could come with the standardized outcomes, but have some sort of search conference or other facilitated participatory engagement with the eventual participants at the outset stage to get their perspective on the salience of those outcomes, even the languaging of those outcomes as pertains to their lived experience. So I think, you know, since the RFP included participatory evaluation as something that they value, adapting outcomes and approaches to particular audiences might be a great opportunity to do some participatory evaluation.
Great, thank you so much for jumping in with that, Tom. Another note is our next webinar will be at the end of February, I believe February 25th, and that's going to focus on two methods that have been used for groups that don't have English as their primary language. For the International Rescue Committee has used this these two different things called, one's Photovoice and one's the most significant change technique, and those are very participatory, driven by the folks doing them methods, and we'll be getting out an announcement on that soon, but along with that announcement will be some reading materials in case you want to take a look at those ahead of time. Other resources for helping you out with a RFA are also our Evaluation 101 webinar. It's on our website, and that just hits on what are the main components. It's a half an hour long. It hits on the main components of what you do in an evaluation, and then highlights for the different, kind of 4 different components. It highlights a couple salient resources to use. So that can be a nice thing to refer to. We have both the webinar and the slides on our website. We also, as part of the group project, have an evaluation resource library, and that's a place where you can go and find all kinds of stuff. There's been so many tools created for evaluation that we didn't really want to recreate all that, and instead I think we shared a somewhat overwhelming amount of resources that are available. There's all kinds of how-to guides to do the whole process, to just do data collection or create a theory of change. There's templates, again, like Tom showed, a few different kinds of templates to create an evaluation plan. There's a few of those up there as well. And we have materials from other beginning farmer and rancher programs. So we've got surveys that different programs have been willing to share, example reports, things of that nature. And another document that can be really useful is the evaluation of the BFRDP funding program that was published in 2017. It was led by the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. We use that to create the outcome list. So a lot of the common outcomes that are identified, we've captured, but it also has examples of best practices and that were collected from project directors. That can be a useful thing to use. And we also have another webinar that I did along with New Entry Sustainable Farming Project a couple years ago that's online. called Developing an Evaluation Plan and Looking at the Outcomes and Measures. And it focuses on things that are really different than this webinar. And in particular, it has 3 example kinds of programs and looking at what you might use for short-term and medium-term outcomes for those programs, what the indicators might look like, I believe. I might be wrong about the indicators. And then what kind of measures you might use. And so the slides are linked to here and the video recording. And so those, again, can be other useful things. Let's see, we are so about out of time that I'm gonna not go into this. You'll have this on, again, the slides. Evaluation terms, people use them differently, and even evaluators use them differently. And so what I've done here is listed some of the terms you'll see in the BFRDP RFA and also the RVS system, which is where you report. If you get a grant, you'll do your reporting, and to translate them into our tools. So you can always return to that. And, you know, just a few other tips. If you're doing a 3-year BFRDP, you'll probably want to use both short-term and medium-term outcomes. So things that happen right after your trainings, and then try and get at what are the behavior changes that have happened as a result. If you're doing a 1-year project, it might make more sense just to do short-term outcomes, because particularly there's the smaller projects that are only, I believe, $50,000 projects. That's not a lot of money to do a kind of follow-up evaluation that's often required for a medium-term, to get at medium-term outcomes. Let's see, what else do I want to share? I think I'm going to end there for now, and we'll just go to your questions.
So Jan, there was one question from Kevin Cody about doing long-term or longitudinal evaluation on a later life cycle program, so for which that would be appropriate, especially when desired program outcomes may have changed over time. And so I think, and then John Mark had a question about the IRC source, which will be shared in the subsequent webinar. But I think, so that one, the name of one of those IRC approaches was Most Significant Change, which is, again, a sort of relatively novel, just within the past 15 years, approach that focuses on potentially long-term outcomes, even in a context where things have changed. It tends to be more used at the individual level. There's a parallel approach called outcome harvesting, which might be helpful in your situation, Kevin. Now, it's a little bit tricky because it's gaining respectability within the evaluation field, but it's still sort of a non-traditional approach. And it's also very participatory, and generally does require someone with some expertise in it to co-facilitate the process. But that one's called outcome harvesting, and we could, Jan, if we don't have any resources on that yet, actually I recently found a series of 5 or 6 videos that do a really good job, animated videos that do a really good job of introducing outcome harvesting. And then one last,
that sounds great.
In relation to Kevin's question, it was developed in the international development space, but there is a book that's now in its 2nd or 3rd edition called Real World Evaluation. It's written by Michael Bamberger and Jim Rugg, and they really focus on a similar situation to the one you described, where either, you know, it's a 5-year program that's wrapping up, and the funder wants you to make some claims about long-term impacts, but you don't really have a baseline because either no one collected it at the beginning or because the context has shifted, like you say, and they emphasize how to make some sense of that, even with limited time, limited budget, and, you know, on a shoestring. So that book is called Real World Evaluation, and we could, again, put a link to that in the notes along with this webinar. So outcome harvesting, most significant change, and real world evaluation might be appropriate for your context.
Great. Maybe you could send me those links, Tom, and we'll send that out with our follow-up email.
Certainly.
And we are out of time. So we've got a survey link in the chat. And if you would be willing to Fill that out and give us some feedback. It's also a good place to tell us what you'd like to see next. And if there's ways we can build on this that are fruitful, we'd love to know that. We've also sent a link to your email right now. You should have it if you want to go check your email. It's 12 o'clock here in California. Thank you so much, Tom. That was really great. I really appreciate all of that. And we look forward to meeting with you all in February.
Thanks, y'all.
Oh, someone doesn't see a survey. And take a look in your email. Hopefully it will be there. Let's see, I'm going to try and just... I can get to the survey by clicking on the link here in the chat box. So hopefully you could want to copy and paste the whole thing. All right, thank you, everybody.